But let me just begin by inviting. We're going to have three groups of fellows come up here, and they will introduce themselves and talk about what they're doing, and we'll have a super fast conversation. So just to make sure that we squeeze every bit of content that we can out of these conversations in the time allotted, please save your applause until all four have finished. Tempting though it may be to break into clapping. Now, our first group of fellows, please join us. The Mary Ellen von der Heyden Fellow, Heidi Julavits, from the great state of Maine, I should add. Come on up. Yeah. Come on down. The John P. Birkeland Fellow in the Humanities, Johannes von Moltke, from the great state of Vermont. Anna Maria Kellen Fellow, Lee Ryford. And the Ellen Maria Gorison Fellow, Mark Massoud. So this is a highly scripted thing, and we have to go in exactly the order I brought you up. And so, Heidi, you get to go first.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Heidi Julavits, and I'm a novelist and a nonfiction writer, and I teach at Columbia University's School of the Arts. I'm also fortunate enough to say that this is my second time at the Academy. As the partner of a fellow 10 years ago, I wrote a large part of a previous book in that library called The Folded Clock, a Diary, in which the American Academy and its staff and its fellows and its automated lawnmowers all featured regularly. Now that I'm my own fellow, the Mary Ellen von der Heyden Fellow in Letters, I'll start work on a project that technically began in 2014 when I searched for a 1960s crewneck sweater on eBay and stumbled upon a seller who'd listed the entire estate of a dead French actress. I made many failed efforts to contact the seller to learn more about this actress. Meanwhile, I felt compelled to buy more and more of her estate, not limited to a pregnancy dress and some fox-shaped knife rests, because it seemed like the actress, via her ever-scattering belongings, was experiencing a second death. And because we're meant to entice you this evening, I won't reveal who the seller turned out to be and how our relationship evolved and how I will be trying later this spring to break into the actress's former house in Brittany. I will reveal that this project, which I initially thought was about obsession and identity theft, is instead about burden and waste, value and trash, exposure and burial, the material and the metaphysical, the man-made and the environmental. These acts of acquisition made me think about how much control or say or design we have over our own deaths, assuming we have any at all, and how we might also redesign our memorializing and mourning rituals, and how our loved ones might participate in our leave-taking while we're still alive. Finally, I will also be incorporating the following three threads. 1, an art world scam artist I worked with who may or may not have died in 2016. 2, an older couple's joint life-taking and the explanatory note they published in my local Maine newspaper. 3, the non-natural hill of Teufelsberg, which I need not tell anyone here, is made from the World War II rubble of Berlin, was once a U.S. Cold War listening station, has buried beneath it a partially completed military technical college designed by Albert Speer, and is now sometimes used for sledding. I am truly honored to be back. Thank you.
Good luck, Johannes.
That's what I'm thinking. I now have 2 impossible acts to follow. But I did want to take a moment, as somebody who travels a fair bit back and forth across the Atlantic, to thank you, Thomas Bagger, for those really remarkable comments. And I want to challenge this illustrious crowd that if there's anybody who knows how to play the Basin City Blues, to open that amazing Bösendorfer grand piano and do it after this. I also don't have an eBay origin story for my project, but there is something on the internet, inevitably, that where this all began, in particular on the dark side of the internet. I should say that I'm Johannes von Meutgen, that I teach at the University of Michigan in German Studies and Film Studies, and that I'm very pleased to be the John Birkeland Fellow here at the Academy. I'd written a book on the film scholar and critical theorist Siegfried Kracauer, and was teaching a grad seminar on the Frankfurt School, a group of influential thinkers who drew on Freud and Marx to develop a critical theory of society and culture. And in this context, a graduate student drew my attention to a diagram that was circulating on the message board 4chan under the heading Cultural Marxism, a conspiracy flowchart that resembled nothing so much as a spider's web. In the center of that spider's web was nothing but the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, the very object that we were studying, which had caught the attention or maybe fueled the wild imagination of the alt-right. So this was, to me, a stunning fact at the time. It's a few years back now, and some of you will have heard the term in the meantime, since it circulates at the highest levels of politics by now. But that the thinkers who we were studying had a second life in a right-wing conspiracy theory about the left-wing assault on academia and some notion of Western culture. So I tumbled down that rabbit hole of cultural Marxism and into the broader cultural politics of what was then called the alt-right. And this is now my project at the Academy, where I'm working on a set of public lectures in which I aim to examine the cultural politics of the new right from a transatlantic perspective. You might ask why the cultural politics, given that we have plenty of things to worry about on the electoral politics and the institutional politics of the alt-right, given the obvious successes or the all but total control of the MAGA movement over the Republican Party or the polling numbers of the AfD in Germany. But that's something I'll leave my social scientist and political scientist colleagues to worry about and write about. Because I do think that I think it stands to reason that the cultural politics of the new right are very much part of the strategic design that gets us here. Andrew Breitbart, one of the founding figures of the alt-right and Breitbart News, is quoted often in right-wing circles with the mantra that politics is downstream from culture, by which he helps to define or picks up a long thread of what the cultural what the right talks about as their meta-politics. And that's my interest, is in understanding, traveling back upstream from politics then to culture, to understand at the source what it is that drives the right-wing thinkers in ideas that they've been elaborating in France since the 1970s, also in Germany and the United States today. We can talk afterwards about examples of all these things, which I won't bore you with right now, but it is confounding and characteristic that many of the cultural strategies of the new right draw on traditions and theories of the left, including the critical theorists in the seminar that I was teaching. And these are very strange mirror effects that I'm interested in understanding and unpacking. My interests in this regard range broadly across areas of culture, language, and discourse, from memory culture to academic culture and artistic freedom, from the literary politics of the new right to the cultural politics of identity, which turn into identitarianism. And because I'm a film scholar and the Oscars are coming up, I've been dying to say this. Thank you to the Academy.
You get the Jean Hirschhold Humanitarian Award for that.
I think we've already broken the rules by applauding, but that's okay.
It's irresistible.
Well, I think that means there's a lot of joy and enthusiasm in the room. And I also want to add my gratitude to Thomas Bagger's beautiful tribute and the invitation to all of us to open the future and imagine more just futures for all of us. My name is Lee Rayford. I am a professor of African American Studies at the University of California at Berkeley. There I teach and research and write and curate about race, gender, and visuality. And I'm very pleased to be in residence here at the Academy this spring as the Anna Maria Kellen Fellow. My research broadly studies how people use photography to make and unmake meaning about themselves and the world around them, in a sense, that intersection or even the constellation of culture and politics that Johannes was referencing. And I'm particularly interested in the ways photography shapes ideas about who belongs in our society and who doesn't, about who has the right to political representation, to economic security, and to cultural and corporeal dignity. And I center those questions around Black people in the United States and across the world. I have authored, co-authored, co-edited 4 books that center these questions about race, gender, photography, justice. My first book was entitled Imprisoned in a Luminous Glare, Photography and the African American Freedom Struggle. And it details the history of photography as a social movement strategy in the service of anti-lynching, civil rights, and Black power movements. While here, at the Academy this spring in the beautiful quiet, I'm completing a book entitled When Home is a Photograph, Blackness and Belonging in the World, which asks, how do Black people use photography to make home in a world that is, by and large, anti-Black? While my other projects have largely focused on photography as a formal political tool or as a conscious weapon, this book turns its attention to the ways quotidian photographs, quiet, you can see a theme here, quiet, images of family, of the domestic, of the everyday, of the unspectacular, give shape to our understanding, visualization, and valuing of Black life. So this book also spans 100 years, and it includes a chapter that draws on 3 years I spent leading a team, organizing, cataloging, digitizing the personal photography collection of Black Panther Party leader Kathleen Neal Cleaver. And this spring, I will be researching the photography archive of Black feminist lesbian poet Audre Lorde during her time here in Berlin. So Johannes talked a little bit about the relationship between culture and politics. And I think the question always for me is, why does photography matter? Well, as scholar Nicholas Mirzoff reminds us, every 2 minutes, Americans alone take more photographs than were made in the entire 19th century. So I'm going to use the end of my 2 minutes to be an American who takes a photograph. Mark just scared me by saying that Germans don't like selfies, but it's okay because I'm not German. So wave, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Massoud. I am the Ellen Maria Gorison Fellow in Law this spring semester. I teach politics and legal studies at the University of California in Santa Cruz. We currently live in a time in which many people have vilified religions, and there are probably many reasons to vilify religion. People who turn to religion to wage wars of national identity, to persecute minorities, to oppress women. And a lot of people have had these views about Islam, negative views about Islam. In the US, nearly every state has introduced or passed a bill banning Sharia, which is commonly translated as Islamic law. More than 200 anti-Sharia bills across the US. And the US is not alone. Here in Germany, the former Chancellor Angela Merkel said that there is no place for Sharia here in Germany. My work explores the history behind this vilification of Sharia in the US context, and I'm looking comparatively at Germany, but really focused on the US. In the US, there are specific parallels that I'm finding with anti-Catholic sentiment in the 19th century. Anti-Jewish exclusion from businesses, social institutions, universities in the 20th century. But Sharia has multiple meanings. There's certainly some meanings that are weaponized by the far right. There are also other meanings of how Muslims are experiencing Sharia and living Sharia in daily life. So with a colleague, a professor of religious studies, we asked Muslims in the US, what does Sharia mean to you? How are you living Sharia in the context of this vilification or legal attempt to ban Sharia? I'll share some of my results in my talk on April 16th, but for now, let me just say that what we learned was remarkable. People were seeing Sharia rather than as a legal system to be feared. Sharia was kind of an ethical guide, an instruction manual for people to learn to care for themselves, their bodies, to care for one another, friends, strangers, loved ones, to care for the environment, to provide hope at a time where for the people I was meeting, hope was in short supply. I'm really glad to be here in Germany. It's a large and multicultural and plural democracy. And I think people here care about religion and care about history and care about law. And I care about all three of those things. So I'm really excited to be here. And I hope that my research helps us to challenge these negative perceptions of Sharia on both sides of the Atlantic and to provide hope for all of us. Thanks.
So just a few quick questions. Mark, I'm fascinated by your project as someone who studied how the U.S. dealt with its Muslim minority in the aftermath of 9/11. What is your answer to the question, well, that was just part and parcel of all the post-9/11 Islamophobia. What is the special valence of Sharia that you think is so important here?
Yeah, for me, as someone who is trained, thank you for the question. As someone who was trained as a lawyer, when I first started seeing about a decade ago these anti-Sharia bills emerging, it was interesting to me that people were trying to ban what they saw as a legal system and also as a kind of religious order, so in violation of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And indeed, many of these laws, or all of these laws that I mentioned, do violate the First Amendment and have been found in abrogation of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So some of this has to do with the culture wars. Some of this has to do with, as you were saying, post 9/11 surveillance programs of Muslims. One interesting thing I'm finding is there have been since 2020, in terms of the culture wars, since 2020, there have been over 500 anti-trans bills passed and introduced across state legislatures. So the culture wars have sort of taken a different turn away from religion over the recent past.
Yeah. And the interesting thing, correct me if I'm wrong, is that an anti-Sharia legislation is something sort of beyond what we in the U.S. would call belt and suspenders, because in fact the Establishment Clause of the Constitution already prohibits the introduction of any foreign or religious code of law into practice. So yet another sign of just how kind of crazy this whole thing was.
Yeah, Sharia became a flashpoint it became a word that signaled or unfurled a whole set of associations around Muslims and Islam. In the decades after 9/11, yeah. Absolutely.
Lee, I think we have a kind of recurrent thing that happens at the Academy, which is we seem to have a fellow at least once a year who's here, who is completely fascinated by Audre Lorde, and we have plenty of people. Probably, I'm guessing, I could be wrong, I just could be an ignoramus, but who don't know much about Audre Lorde. So why don't you tell us what it is that is so compelling about her and her work?
Absolutely. So Audre Lorde described herself as a Black woman, feminist, warrior, poet. Across the length of her career, her life, She really thought at the intersection of race, gender, sexuality, ability, what we now call intersectional feminism. Audre Lorde was at the forefront of that. And her writing forms a kind of canon for people who were interested in these questions, who were interested in how to live and love themselves fully when the world tells you that you're wrong in so many ways. What is particularly exciting and I think fascinating for Black feminists and many people in the world is that at the invitation of scholar of Dagmar Schultz, Lorde came to Berlin in the 80s and ended up spending, a decade here, particularly at a time when she'd been diagnosed with cancer. And she talks about Berlin as putting years on her life, extending her life. And that is not something, and I have to say, Black feminism and Berlin are not necessarily two ideas that people think go together. And I think that's a different intersection that many of us in my field are drawn to. What is it about this place in that moment that gave such life to a writer, thinker, poet, activist who is so important to so many?
Okay, and I just want to point out this is the Californian side of the stage, and I just want to say we must have an enormous drawing power if you two have come from Berkeley and Santa Cruz here at this time of year.
Snow is so fascinating.
Yeah. Johannes, your project gives me some anxiety because, as you may know, a novel loosely based at the American Academy was written, and the protagonist goes down the rat hole of 4chan. Are you aware of this book, Harry Kunzru's Red Pill?
I'm on page 70.
Yeah. Well, let me just begin by extracting from you a pledge that you will depict the Academy in a more appealing light than Harry did. I gave Harry a hard time at an event in New York. He was shocked when I said, does it keep you up at night that you depicted us so negatively? So what attracted you to this this dark, cramped, and reeking world of 4chan and the dark internet?
Nothing attracted me. I think it needs to be aired out. I mean, I think, there's always, I'm just back from a conference on the literary politics of the New Right, and every time we gather to talk about these kinds of things, there's always the question, are you oxygenating the discourse? Are you legitimizing it? Are you giving it academic honors, et cetera? And that, I think that's a real question, because we're answering, as I was trying to point out, we're answering strategic interventions that are trying to get us to do exactly these things. So if you want to follow that up, just go online and look at what Götz Kubitschek was doing in Vienna last week, where he held a speech, and the speech about Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, and was not admitted by the university into its halls. So he held the speech on in a place of the Vienna University inauspiciously called Die Rampe, the ramp. And he stood on the ramp, and the whole speech about Bradbury was about him being canceled and not being, and that it was all calculated as part of it. So there's always this worry that by giving in to the felt need to air this out or oxygenate, like that, or get some sunlight in, that you might be somehow adding to the discourse. But I do think that in the end, understanding the logics is naive. We can't be naive about it. We need to understand the logics of it. Another example from right now is the fact that the newspapers are repeating the term remigration. Some of you may be in the streets protesting on this basis. Remigration is a term that I know from my book about Siegfried Kracauer, who decided not to remigrate into Germany after he went into exile. Some people did. That was what remigration was at the time. Now it's a term that means expulsion, deportation, but the shifting of the discourse has worked in such an effective way that few stop to question that. And I think doing this kind of work still remains necessary and relevant, even if it's not attractive. And as for Harry Kunzru, I just don't compete with novelists. Over to you.
It's
a good book. We're still proud of him.
I have to just say, Johannes, you've been on page 70 for like many days now. We keep serious. He has the one copy out of the library, and we're like, can you? Yeah.
I was at a conference.
Okay, all right. Good.
Well,
Reason.
Heidi, you get the prize for like ratting out one of your fellows in public.
I mean,
you're the first to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be doing it many more times.
Okay.
So,
So Heidi, you are our recidivist.
Mm-hmm.
You're back for
Yes.
a second time in the Slammer, as it were.
yes.
Was there anything about this particular project that you said, I got to do this in Berlin?
I would say that part of what the project is for me, so the book that I wrote before, which is called The Folded Clock, is very much a kind of looking at kind of dailiness and looking at these sort of almost seemingly banal moments and how they can be portals into these much more sort of like philosophical, spiritual, intellectual spaces. Because what I am working on is very much about like, in a sense, objects and the detritus of someone's past. This place, I don't mean to call it the detritus of my past. It is not. But
Thank you for that.
yeah. But I will say that, I mean, just in terms of it being a kind of a continuum in my work, we're turning to this place. There's a lot about geography in all of the books that I've been writing. And so coming to this geographical space felt really crucial to me in terms of being able to link all of these things together in some fashion. And what I'm working on is actually, I mean, I was sort of a little bit coy about how I spoke about it because I actually don't think we have the language yet to talk about it. I don't know if anyone noticed, but I did not use the word suicide. That's not a word that I feel is helpful in trying to talk about end-of-life compassionate choices that people, I use the word leave-taking. It's a very complicated subject, and one that is differently culturally complicated, obviously. And so that is also something that I will be grappling with here, not just the emotional overwhelmingness of it, but also a way to find language so that people can talk about it without throwing up a barrier or feeling like it is just a place we don't want to go.
Okay. Well, you all know where to hear more about these projects. I'm going to let you all go and take the next group, but Johannes, please finish up the book, okay? Okay. And our next contestants are... We have Axel Springer Fellow Mark Koplovich, Dirk Ippen Fellow Samantha Schnee, American Political Economy Fellow Margaret Weir, Presidential Fellow Adam Weinberg. And I want to point out that Margaret is our inaugural American Political Economy Fellow, and maybe we'll ask her what that is, and that we are extremely grateful to the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation for their generous funding of this newly established fellowship. So, okay, Mark, you get to go first.
Guten Abend. Hi, everybody. My name is Mark Koplovich. I am Professor of Political Science and Public Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I am the Axel Springer Fellow this spring at the Academy. So my work is about intersections. I'm a political scientist by training, but I study the intersection of international politics and international economics. And in terms of the politics that I focus on, the intersection between domestic politics and international relations. Substantively, I am a scholar of the politics of international finance. So I've written one book on the causes of financial crises, another one on the politics of the International Monetary Funds, and how the geopolitical and financial interests of the IMF's major shareholders muck up the economic policy. My other scholarly hat is as a scholar of the European Union and the Eurozone, and back at UW, I'm the director of the Center for European Studies. I've been in Berlin actually since August. I've been a visiting scholar at the WC Bay, and my research there has been focused on a set of surveys in the United States and Germany on public opinion in the economy, asking people about how the media that they use and who they talk to about politics shapes their views on inflation, unemployment, and recessions. And you won't be surprised to hear, at least in the United States, that the amount of right-wing media you consume is one of the largest determinants of whether or not you think the U.S. is in a recession and things are bad in terms of inflation in the economy. Here at the Academy, I am working on a new book, tentatively entitled Dollar Signs, The Myth of American Decline and the Future of World Order. The book explores the causes and consequences of the dollar's enduring dominance in the global economy. So despite frequent predictions of its demise, many of which you've read in nearly monthly op-eds in the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal, I'm actually an optimist about the dollar. As a consequence of the financial crises that we have lived through over the last 15 years now, the dollar has actually become more, not less dominant in the global economy and in international finance. At the same time, neither of the supposed major challengers, on the one hand the euro, and on the other hand the Chinese renminbi, meet the economic or political requirements to supplant the dollar as the world's dominant international reserve currency. And this actually has enormous, but I think widely unappreciated consequences for a wide range of economic and foreign policies. In the US, it shapes how we should think about the sustainability of debt and deficits. It shapes how we should think about transatlantic relations. And in particular, it shapes how we should think about the future of American hegemony and the US-China relationship. So I'll talk about all of that in more detail. My lecture here is in April, and I hope that I'll see many of you there. I'm very excited to be here at the Academy. I'm here with my family, my wife Beth, our teenagers Micah and Daphna, who have discovered Marcel's pancakes at breakfast and are extremely happy to be here. And I'm deeply honored and a little intimidated to be part of such an impressive group of fellows. So thank you very much.
Samantha.
My name is Samantha Schnee. I'm the Dirk Ippen Fellow and the founding editor of a website called Words Without Borders that publishes literature translated into English. Since 2003, Words Without Borders has published 4,500 writers translated from 140 different languages, including 7 Nobel laureates, 5 of whom we published long before their recognition by the Swedish Academy, most recently Jan Fosse, last year's laureate, whom we published as early as 2006. Words Without Borders plays an important role in the cultural economy because Anglophone publishing does a very poor job of importing literature into English. Last year, for example, in the United States, less than 5% of the literature that we published was translated from other languages. Compare that to Germany, which publishes 3 times as much literature translated into German. I am also a translator from the Spanish, and when I find writing that I believe is of exceptional value, I often take it on as a translator, as a personal project. And while I'm here in Berlin, I will work with the Basque author, Irati Elorrieta, who moved to Berlin 20 years ago on an Erasmus grant. Her novel, Winter Lights, tells the story of 2 friends from France and Spain who move to Berlin and develop a circle of friends from Denmark, Mexico, Japan, Vietnam, and beyond. And it's told from the immigrant's perspective, viewing Berlin as a palimpsest and examining layers of history through immigrants' eyes. It also offers a very personal and intimate view of life in this city and references the work of French New Wave cinema, particularly that of Agnès Varda, who is the namesake of the main character. And above all, it is a love letter to this multicultural and kaleidoscopic city. And I'm very grateful to be able to be here and work directly with the author to complete this translation this semester. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Margaret Weir. I'm the American Political Economy Fellow. I'm professor of political science and public policy at Brown University, but I also had a Berkeley connection for many, many years. My work focuses on inequality and social policy. I've written on employment policies in the United States, and recently I've become more interested in spatial inequality in the U.S. During my stay here, I'll be completing a book that's entitled The New Metropolis, The Political Architecture of Inequality in 21st Century America. The book examines new patterns of spatial inequality. Historically, the way we thought about spatial inequality in the U.S., it was focused on the division between the poor black city and the white affluent suburb. And that stereotypical picture never captured the complexity of U.S. metro areas, and by now it is certainly obsolete. Over the past 30 years, suburban poverty has risen. The majority of low-income people now live in suburban areas, not in what you think of as the historic central city. Large-scale immigration has transformed both cities and suburbs, and many cities or parts of them have undergone gentrification. Amidst all these changes, somehow we have created new forms of spatial inequality. No longer is the city-suburban line the only significant division. Now suburbs themselves are divided by race, by income, and ethnicity. To understand these changes, I dive into three metros, Chicago, Atlanta, and Houston. The latter two are to make sure to focus on the diverse patterns that we see in the Sun Belt cities that are often not studied as much in the United States. And my analysis focuses on the politics of boundaries. How are political boundaries created? How does race and immigration shape the meaning of public boundaries? And how do those boundaries end up creating substantial inequalities in access to public goods? So the argument I'm making is if you want to understand inequality in the United States, you need to look locally, and that's what I hope this project does. And I'll conclude by saying, as a student of cities, I am thrilled to be in Berlin and to have a chance to explore one of the world's great cities. So thank you.
Good evening. I'm Adam Weinberg, the Presidential Fellow and Director Emeritus of the Whitney Museum of American Art, where I served as director for the last 20 years. I, too, want to thank Thomas Bager for his comments tonight. I am not only the art guy here, but I like to think that I'm the one with the hopeful project. I'm listening to these projects, and it's a little bit of a downer, but I know it's all for the good spirit. Throughout its nearly 100-year history, the Whitney Museum has been a site of controversy. As a museum devoted to art in real time, it is a lightning rod for aesthetic, social, and political issues addressed by artists of the present. On the flip side of this, the Whitney in my 5 years in the museum field, I've been continually struck by the way in which museums have taken on a special status in our culture. They are more than places for just collecting, displaying works of art, for entertainment, for spectacle, but especially evident during the pandemic, the museums have become sites for communing, for existential reflection, solace, and dare I say, spiritual nourishment. My book on contemporary artist chapels and sacred spaces is in part a response to the emphasis on the politics that in art and museums today. And in fact, if you just look at the internet the last couple of days and you see the kind of actions that have been taken, whether it's at the Mona Lisa at the Louvre or whether it's at Pace Gallery in New York, you can see how art is always a great lightning rod for the politics of our time. So for this reason, I have to say I am particularly focused on this project of artist chapels and sacred spaces. And my hope is that in my abiding interest in the shifting role of contemporary art and artists in relationship to the spiritual, that we will find new meanings about what museums and actually what chapels and religious sites can be. As Susan Sontag posited in the Aesthetics of Solitude, every era has to reinvent the project of spirituality for itself. In the modern era, one of the most active metaphors for the spiritual project is art. I am considering what constitutes spiritual art and spiritual space at present, and I'm examining how artists have extended, adapted, and revisioned the spiritual in modern contemporary art. My study originated in 2015 when I attended the inauguration of Ellsworth Kelly's great chapel in Austin, Texas at the University of Texas. Having recently revisited Mark Rothko's chapel and James Turrell's great Friends Meetings House, and Turrell also has a chapel here in Berlin, which I look forward to visiting, I soon realized there was no comprehensive study of artist chapels. My research has since revealed some 80 examples by artists well-known, under-recognized, and self-taught. My project focuses primarily on the visions of 20th and 21st century artists and their desire to enlarge their practice to a grand, more comprehensive scale in line with the modern conceptions of installation art. The book will be organized under such themes as to believe or not to believe, chapels of light, chapels of resistance, and include artists like Henri Matisse and Jean Cocteau and Louise Bourgeois, Sala Witt, Hiroshi Sugimoto, the Esther Gates Maya Lin, and there's a great example by Günter Uecker in the Bundestag of the Great Prayer Room, which is a place that many of you might not even know that even exists. So these places exist all over. They're kind of hidden gems, and part of it is the pilgrimage to seek them out. I have to say I'm very honored to be here. I'm loving my time already in 10 days. And having lived in Minnesota, in upstate New York, and in New England, Berlin's nothing in terms of weather.
Okay, I'm going to jump around a little bit. Margaret, what is the American political economy movement or effort, if you will?
Well, it's an effort to understand how the economy and politics are intertwined in the way America operates. So, for example, in my project, one of the things I pay a lot of attention to, in addition to boundaries, is the role of the real estate industry, which is Donald Trump. But the real estate industry is very uncontrolled in the United States, and it's a very important factor in creating patterns of inequality because we have, if you go, for example, to Houston, it just keeps going and going and going with new developments, and these developments are organized in ways that keep people of relatively similar economic backgrounds together. And you don't see that mixing. And what it ends up meaning is that people live in spaces that have access to different kinds of public and private facilities. And particularly in the Sun Belt, people do not have public facilities, they have private facilities. So if you go to many places in the Sun Belt, people live in places where all the amenities are privately provided and not publicly provided. So it's connected to this sort of death of the public, or both the fragmenting and the death of the public in the United States. So that's just an example of bringing in something about how the way that our economy works to then affect our politics.
Have you talked about Houston with Samantha?
Yes.
Samantha recently relocated from warm and muggy Houston to warmer and muggy Abu Dhabi. And that's why she's in Berlin now. Yeah. Samantha, Words Without Borders is such a great creation. Where on earth did the inspiration come from?
It came from an editor at W.W. Norton called Elaine Mason, who sat on a NEA panel granting money to support projects for the arts. And I think after she sat on that panel, she thought, I could write a better proposal than half of these proposals. So, and this is back in 2001. So she wrote a proposal, and it was funded. The thing about the National Endowment for the Arts is you have to match the funding that you receive as an organization. So she then had to go out to all of her friends and family and raise another $35,000, which took a year and a bit. And I met her when I was at a meeting at Penn. Penn is Poets, Essayists, and Novelists. It's an international organization of writers. Translation committee meeting, and she made a presentation about this funding that she had received to start Words Without Borders. And I literally ran up to her afterwards and said, this is my dream job. And when you're ready to hire someone, I'm ready to work for you. And she said, let's have lunch next week. So that was that.
Well, seizing the day, right. And you also have a history in Berlin.
I do. So I was here twice. The first time I came to Berlin was in 1990. I was doing a language study program my second year at university, and my professor, who was brilliant, took us to Berlin for a week. And we were able to see Berlin when Checkpoint Charlie was still, and we had to sort of pass through Checkpoint Charlie to go into East Berlin at that time. We had to change our money. We had to be out by midnight. We were warned by our professor on pain of death or spending the night there, and which probably wouldn't have been so bad. It was a fascinating place. And then I loved that so much that I came back. In 1992, I petitioned to go off campus in my final year and do a program here, which compared the literature. It was... We would read a play by Heinrich von Kleist, whose grave is right over here, as many of you know, or Schiller, Boto Strauss, and then we would go and watch the production in East Berlin and watch the production in West Berlin. Something that was a brilliant curriculum devised by a professor that was specific to that point in time, because obviously over time these two separate cultural entities sort of melded into one. And it has been a dream of mine to come back to Berlin ever since then. So, as I said before, I'm extremely grateful to be here, and it's just a fantastic city. So I'm looking forward to getting to know it again.
I should mention about Mark that for those of you who still venture onto the website known as X, the platform known as X, formerly known as Twitter, Mark is one great tweeter, and I really recommend you follow him, because his tweets are often just laugh out loud good. And continuing on that theme, Mark, when you talk to Europeans, well, broadly speaking, about your thoughts about the durability of U.S. power and the durability of the dollar, what kind of reactions do you get? Because this is like ground zero for declinism, you know? Like we're finished. The American Academy is going to be all that's left at some point, because we are vigorous here. But I'm curious what kinds of reactions you get.
Yeah, so I think everybody I talk to in Berlin is terrified about November, as you know. So any hope that we came here to escape that. Obviously, I learned very on, getting here in August that was not going to happen. I think what most of the time the discussion ends up coming around to what I think of as distinguishing between the ability of the United States to do something and the willingness of the United States to do something, right? So, most of the focus here and in the United States about the decline of American hegemony or American power is that for domestic political reasons, we're going to choose not to do things and shoot ourselves in the foot. And we're doing a fairly good job of that in recent years. But there are structural factors about the global economy and the international system that are enduring. And here in Europe and back home in the United States, I think there's a tendency to look at the problems in your own country and think that they're more serious than the problems elsewhere. right? And so I think one of the ways in these conversations that I come around to talking to people is there are a lot of structural problems in the Eurozone and the European Union and domestic politics in Germany and in Europe, which prevent the EU from doing things in the international system. And China's domestic economic and political problems, if anything, look more serious at this point than ours do, right? So, that's not maybe a sort of message of optimism, but there's a sort of relative aspect of this where in the United States and here in Europe, we tend to focus on the US has problems, they're new problems, or they're more serious old problems, and therefore the US is in decline. But decline is a relative phenomenon, right? And as much as America has turned inward politically and you have the threat of authoritarianism and whatnot, the structural foundations of the global economy, it's actually moved in the other direction in sequential economic crises, right? I mean, we caused the global financial crisis in 2008, and the dollar actually came out more dominant and entrenched because of that. And the same thing happened in the wake of the euro crisis, and as well with the COVID economic crisis. And so, there are these forces moving in both directions, and I'm trying to get us to focus on distinguishing that ability from the willingness, and thinking about what may be driving American decline might be choices about domestic politics, but that's different from saying that American power is actually in decline.
We found the upbeat person for this semester. Okay. Along with you, Adam. So, Adam, I was, if you're not paying attention, you don't think frequently about just what contested spaces museums are. For some reason that I can't remember, I was reading an article in the New Yorker by Calvin Tompkins, I think shortly after you took over the Whitney, and he was going over how basically people had been writing the obit of the Whitney forever because no one could ever agree on what was American art. So I guess my first question to you is, are you feeling liberated being here and no longer being in your office at the Whitney?
Yes.
Would you have been a less happy guy if we had, just given you a fellowship in place or something?
Yes.
Okay.
They told me to keep it short tonight.
Yeah. And keep going.
Well, I have to say I do feel a bit liberated. I mean, I am not an Americanist by training. I have spent my entire life in museums associated, and not just museums, cultural organizations associated with American, like the American Academy here in Berlin, the Archives of American Art, the Addison Gallery of American Art. And I do feel liberated in a sense because sometimes, and actually I lived abroad in Paris for a while, and often the best way to see America is from outside. And I feel like I have a better sense of what it is to be an American from the outside point of view. And for me also, what I've been thinking about in the last weeks, why Germany for me? I mean, yes, there are examples of the kinds of architecture and art that I want to see here. But I've been thinking a lot about how this is a place that's really about reckoning, both this organization, but also this country. And I've spent, speaking of the protests that have gone on and actually started at the Whitney at its very beginning, I've been really trying to reckon with what have museums become. I spent almost 50 years of my life now working in museums, and they are continually shifting. It's a radically different way of seeing things. There are certain continuing threads. So I think this is a really wonderful place for me to kind of look at it, besides the fact that there are extraordinary museums here. In many ways, this is one of the great homes of where museums were invented. And I just want to remind everybody that if we question the role of museums in relationship to religion, every single one of them, at a certain point, were all based on Greek temples, and you all rose up to the top, and you went there for spiritual edification. And now, in recent times, what we've done with museums, like the Whitney, is kind of dismantle that and rethought that. So.
And it's kind of, for a modernist, it's kind of a busman's holiday, isn't it? Because, I mean, we always tell ourselves that Berlin is one of the great modern art, contemporary art cities in the world. And as someone who actually knows something about this, would you confirm that?
Oh, absolutely. There are so many artists, and not just lots of artists. Some of the greatest artists working today anywhere in the world, from all over the world, are based here in Berlin. And one of the things that I'm going to be doing is hopefully, and already started to do, is to make a lot of studio visits with artists and meet with a lot of the artists who are based here. So.
Can you bring them here too?
Absolutely.
Okay, great.
I already
All right.
offered to do a series of little interviews with them. So.
Thank you very much. We'll go on to the third crowd. Okay, our last panel consists, embarrassingly, I have to say, of 3 men. And I did not design this panel, but I'm not going to announce who did. All right, the Nina Maria Gorison Fellow in History, Noam Lupu. The Gerhard Casper Fellow, James Shapiro. And most importantly of all, because the namesake is here tonight, the Holtzbring Fellow, Michael Meyer. Noam, you are the Stuckey. Go first. The lucky Stuckey.
Great. Thanks. Good evening, everyone. I want to start by adding my thanks to Mr. Bagger for those comments starting off the evening. One thing that struck me about your comments is how they emphasize the role that family history and family experience play in the way that we think about the world and we think about politics. And that, of course, is related to the kinds of things that I think about. So I'm Noam Lupu. I'm the Nina Maria Gorison Fellow. Delighted to be here this spring. I'm a professor of political science at Vanderbilt University. Most of my research actually mostly focuses on Latin America. I sometimes do work on Western Europe as well. But this project that I'm working on here is actually quite a bit more global. And I typically say that my work is on comparative political behavior, which is what we call basically trying to understand how people arrive at their beliefs about politics and the choices that they make, political choices that they make, including who they vote for or different types of political behavior that they engage in. And my project here is focused on the role that violence plays in shaping those political beliefs and political identities. We know from a lot of research in psychology that exposure to violence generates a whole host of psychological effects on people, and PTSD being sort of often the most widely known types of effects. And we also know increasingly from research in psychology that those kinds of effects also get transmitted across generations within families. So it actually turns out that people who never experienced violence themselves, but their parents or grandparents did, experience some of these kinds of psychological effects. So my book that I'm working on here, which is called Children of Violence, partly focuses on the political consequences of those psychological effects. So in the same way that exposure to violence shapes people's psychology, it also has effects on their political beliefs. And also those political beliefs become transmitted across generations. So again, the children and grandchildren of people who lived through periods of violence are shaped by the kinds of experiences that their ancestors had. So that's part of the effort that this book is engaged in. The other is to also think about differences across the kinds of cases that we might think about. So if you think of cases of political violence around the world, and you think of mass repression, genocides, ethnic cleansing, deportations, there are so many different kinds of experiences that people have. And even within a particular sort of conflict or context, you can think of a wide variety of experiences that even people within that same conflict context can have. We're trying to think about how different types of violence and different circumstances also affect whether or not you get certain kinds of political consequences that then get transmitted across generations. So you could think about those questions as, under what kinds of circumstances does violence leave those kinds of lasting legacies on people's political beliefs and political behaviors, or what types of violence produce different kinds of outcomes. And if you want to know the answers to those questions, and in fact how my own family history informs a lot of the research that I've been doing on this, then come back later in the spring and I'll tell you more.
James.
I'm James Shapiro. I'm a professor at Columbia University. I'm the Gerhard Casper Fellow, and I really would like to thank the extraordinary staff at the American Academy that has made me and my wife and the other fellows so incredibly welcome that you're going to have to change the locks in May to get rid of all of us. I spent the first quarter century of my career as a specialist in Shakespeare's England. And Donald Trump put an end to that. When he won in 2016, I realized that my interest in theater and politics had to shift to an America that I did not recognize. And since 2016, I've been committed to a trilogy of books about Shakespeare, politics, and democracy. The first one was called Shakespeare in a Divided America, looked at revolutionary to contemporary America. At the Academy, I'm hoping to finish a second book. It is about the Federal Theater Project of 1935 to 1939. It was the only time America has ever had a federal or national theater. And in that brief period, the Federal Theater staged 1,000 productions in 29 states, seen by 1 out of every 4 Americans who paid next to nothing to see these plays. And it employed 12,000 really out of work and starving artists, including Arthur Miller, one of the first fellows here. And it was destroyed by those in Congress on the right who were threatened by its interracial and progressive politics. The project and the book that will come out of it is called The Playbook, not only for the celebrated plays that were staged, but because the creation of the first House Un-American Activities Committee led to the destruction of the Federal Theater and the creation of the right-wing playbook that is so prevalent now, we forget that it too has a history. And if there's a bit more time towards the end of my stay here, I'll embark on the third part of that trilogy, a biography of a Shakespeare character, Othello. I'm writing Othello's American Life for Yale University Press's Black Lives series.
Hi everyone, how's your energy? Hanging in there? I ran the marathon here, humble brag, and I'll just tell you that the first 23 miles aren't that hard. It's the last 3.2, that are the killer. And in Berlin, at the end, they have tables and tables of beer. And you go to it and you start guzzling it and you realize it's non-alcoholic beer. And so hopefully there's something stronger waiting for all of you outside the door here. Hi, everybody. I'm Michael Meyer. I'm a journalist and nonfiction writer, and I teach both of those things at the University of Pittsburgh. 29 years ago, I was volunteering on the Texas-Mexico border. I was fluent in Spanish, and I thought, I want to keep doing this. So I joined the Peace Corps. And the Peace Corps called me about 6 months later and said, hey, we have a country for you to go to. And I said, awesome, where am I going? And they said, we're sending you to Vladivostok. And I said, that's not a country, and they don't speak Spanish. And they came back with 7 other countries, including Turkmenistan and Sri Lanka, and the list kept going on. And I kept saying, I don't want to go. And they said, well, it's Peace Corps, you can't say no. And I said, but I keep saying no, and you keep giving me new countries. And they called back and they said, final offer, take it or leave it, China. And I said, you've got to be kidding me, like the wisdom of the federal government. And 3 weeks later, I was on a plane. I didn't speak a word of Chinese. I didn't know how to use chopsticks. And I landed in Sichuan in the Southwest, home of the best food on the planet. And I spent 2 years in a village. I was the first American, or first foreigner actually, living out there near the border of Tibet. Liked it a lot, moved to Beijing. I was working as a journalist. I have to say I wasn't a really good journalist, the way Dan was a great journalist. Being a journalist, the way it was done then in China, it felt a bit like I was a vampire. Like I'd parachute into a place and be like, where's my guy, right? Now, put my teeth in and get my quote and then get out. And instead, I wanted to be a toothless vampire. I wanted to land and sort of hang out and sort of just, kind of gum on people and linger. And so I stopped working as a journalist, and instead I moved into Beijing's oldest neighborhood, right next to the edge of Tiananmen Square. I could see it from my home windows. And you know it's time to write a book when the book you want to read doesn't exist. And I spent the next couple of years living in an old courtyard home under threat of destruction for the Olympics, with no plumbing, no air conditioning, obviously no heat in Beijing winters. And the result of that was my first book, The Last Days of Old Beijing. And from there, I moved up north even further to colder areas. I'm from Minnesota, so I like this winter weather. And I lived on a rice farm near the North Korean border for a couple of years and sort of immersed myself in the changes to Chinese agriculture and family farms switching to agribusiness. So I did this for many years, and then the funny thing is, after almost 20 years in China on the mainland and writing 3 books about it, and discovering and reporting from every nook and cranny from Xinjiang all the way down to Hainan Island and Hong Kong, all of a sudden I realized there's this island just offshore named Taiwan. And it's sort of like if you imagine having a 2-room apartment, and then one day you see this door, right? And you open it, and you're like, what's that? And you go through it, and there's this whole other better apartment with different art and different books on the shelves and different food and different history. And so for the past couple of years, I've been living in and traveling around and reporting on a book about Taiwan that I'll be writing here as the Holt Spring Fellow at the Academy. And I kind of think of it as a biography of the island. There's a lot that people don't know about Taiwan. Sam, in her talk, mentioned the word palimpsest, this overlapping of narratives. And there's been, from the Portuguese to the Dutch to the Americans to the British to the Japanese colonists to Han settlers to Aboriginal Taiwanese. There's many contesting narratives on that island. And that's my challenge here, is to write about that. So I'm really honored to be here. Thank you.
And it's worth noting that you are our first presenter, fellow presenting his work tomorrow night, correct?
I am. I'll probably be wearing the same tie, so in the pictures it'll look like we stayed up all night. It'll be great.
Noam, tell us what else you've worked on and why you got this really interesting idea for a book on a subject that I think most laymen would think is, for a psychologist to do.
So I'm going to tell you what my other work has been on, and it'll sound like it has nothing to do with this, and then I'll try to piece this together for you. So my work has been on the decline of political parties in Latin America. That's where I started, and I wrote a book on that. And this glass is moving on its own. This is the ghosts that we've heard about. And I was sort of interested in this question because political parties that had been around for a long time in Latin America were collapsing in the 90s and 2000s. And part of my sort of question about that was, how is it, and particularly coming from the US in the 2000s, how is it that people are suddenly voting for other parties? It's hard to imagine the Democratic Party or the Republican Party being sort of replaced overnight, although certainly many people would like to see that. And that's exactly what was happening in the region. So the question really became how do these deep-seated identities that people have when they attach to political parties suddenly change? And so I sort of wrote a book about that. And it really became, in my mind, a book about identities and where identities come from and how identities, change, sometimes very dramatically in ways that are kind of surprising in our discourse that sort of talks about identities and, identity politics as though identities are super fixed and incredibly hard to change. And that led me to this question about the role of violence that also kind of harkens back to, as I mentioned, my own family history and kind of a long history of thinking about this question of how do generations shape each other and how does violence sort of affect families across generations. So that's how I came to this.
Very interesting. James, you are working on the Federal Theater, but you are a Shakespearean landed in a nation crazed about Shakespeare. Are you fighting them off?
No, I mean, Shakespeare's better in German, so it's the right place to be. I should say that my work prospers from distance. And even as I was able to see things about England from my base in New York, I'm hoping that being away from these tumultuous days politically in the States allows me to see things. I was in Berlin for the first time in 1989. I was a Fulbright scholar in Israel, and they sent me to a meeting here in Berlin. And the first thing I did was made a beeline across Checkpoint Charlie, the wall wasn't down yet, to see a Brecht play. And there were no seats available. It was sold out. They found me a seat. And I was sitting among Russian generals. And you could almost feel the wall crumbling at that moment. There's a way in which theater, if you feel it strongly enough in the audience, behind the scenes, tells you something about the world that no-knock journalists cannot tell you. And I'm really excited about the theater scene in Berlin this spring.
I don't feel knocked.
I think we should feel a little knocked.
Oh, we should?
Yeah.
I'm probably not sharp enough to know when I've been knocked. One of the things that really impressed me, Michael, about your Lebenslauf, as we say here in Germany, your CV, is that even though you have this incredibly deep vein of Chinese work that you've done, you've written on a lot of different things. You're like enjoying being a writer and being able to work on whatever you want, aren't you?
Yes.
That was a way to suggest. Maybe you tell us about it.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think writers are naturally curious and intellectually ambitious and empathetic with their readers. And my ideal reader is someone like running through an airport and they need a book quick. And there's something that looks really cool, so they want to grab that one. I have a book out next week about Annie Besant, who was put on trial in 1877 Victorian London for publishing an American birth control pamphlet. So 50 years before Virginia Woolf said a woman needs a room of her own in which to write, Annie Besant owned her own press. And 45 years before the first British woman was allowed to pass the bar, Annie Besant decided to defend herself. And she did it in front of the Lord Chief Justice, the highest judge, and she did it in the highest court, which was then attached to Westminster Hall. So she's a remarkable person, and I just was, it was a treat during COVID and the pandemic to spend time with their stories. And I should note, Dan, on that, like, I think one thing I will defend journalism a bit here in that in my stories, I'm not a character. I'm really just trying to be the vessel in which people tell their stories. And, one thing that is related to Berlin, especially with Taiwan, and I'll talk about this if you're able to come back tomorrow, is just, Berlin is a perfect place to think about these, reunification, reconciliation, commemoration of a tragic past, and how you choose to do those things, if you should do those things, and how long it takes to do those things, right? The Wannsee Conference House, for example, Mr. Wolf committed suicide or took leave of this world, long before it was open. It wasn't open until 1992, and Helmut Kohl refused to come to the opening. And so nowadays, I think we come and we see, I run the Berlin Wall route here in the woods, and there's these great markers where people were killed and so forth. And you think like, there's never any top down like, hey, you know what we should do? Let's remember our horrible history. These are usually grassroots movements that come up, and Taiwan is going through this right now. There's an Emily Dickinson poem, and I'll end on this, I promise, that after great pain, a formal feeling comes. And she compares at the end of the poem, it's like people who have died freezing in snow, this is the leaden hour, she says. First the chill, then the dread, and then the letting go. And I think that Berlin is very much in the letting go phase of things, where Taiwan is in that middle phase. They've endured the chill, 38 years of martial law, but there's still very big questions going on in that country right now about what should be commemorated, whose voices should be heard, and how do you move forward.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. At this point, you're undoubtedly thinking that you've come through, you've survived, but in fact, there is one more fellow who could not be with us, and we're going to have a brief video message from him. He is Albert Hoffman. He's our Bayer Fellow in Public Health.
Great pleasure to join you, if only in this indirect way. My apologies that I cannot be present with you, but I certainly hope to join you all in February. My name is Bert Hoffman. I'm a professor and chair of epidemiology at Harvard, at the Harvard School of Public Health. By training, I am an MD and an internist, but relatively early in my career and after my studies, I went into clinical epidemiology, and I must say I've never regretted that. I am since 2015 at the Department of Epidemiology at the Harvard School of Public Health. Before that, I was chair and professor of clinical epidemiology at Erasmus University in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. In fact, I am still a Dutch national. My area of work is in Alzheimer's disease and dementia, a major pandemic, as you know. And in particular, I work on vascular risk factors, so the circulation in relation to the occurrence of Alzheimer's disease and its possible prevention. The topic that I will work on during my stay in my fellowship at the American Academy, and also the topic that I will address during my public lecture, is actually about epidemics at large, and in particular about the occurrence and the further development of epidemics. I take it from the opioid crisis, the opioid epidemic in the US, of course, also the COVID-19 pandemic, but also the very, very big current obesity and diabetes pandemic. And I will talk about that in my public lecture under the title, Why Are Epidemiologists So Bad at Epidemics? I hope to see you all soon. Thank you very much.
Okay, so let me just close by saying you're all wondering why we have a Dutchman coming to the American Academy in Berlin. If you work at an American institution, you're eligible. That's how we feel. We're an inclusive nation, and I hope we stay that way. So let me just say in closing, thank you for coming tonight. I hope that it has whetted your intellectual appetites and that we will see you all again soon. Please do have a look at the printed program. It's filled with untold riches, not only for the fellows, that is, not only the fellows' presentations, but a number of other events with distinguished visitors. As I said, Michael Meyer will be speaking tomorrow about his book, Taiwan Rising, here at 7:30. And now, please go have a drink and a bite. Thank you so much for coming.